Welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Stephanie Rozene.
And I'm Paul Greenhalgh, and today's story takes us to China, to the Tang Dynasty, which ruled over China from 618 to 907, and is often being considered by the Chinese themselves as a golden age. There are several contenders, but this is definitely one of them. And we would say, wouldn't we, Stephanie, that's hugely because of the amazing ceramics that they made, amongst other things, conquering the world, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before we get into the Tang Dynasty, let's just very briefly recap where we are. We did an episode on the Terracotta warriors, which we said then, with the Qin dynasty, really kicks China off. The dynasty which unifies China, and immediately after that, the Han, which consolidate. So when we talk about the Chinese dynasties, they come one after the other. Some of them last for many hundreds of years. Some of them are incredibly quick.
Yeah.
So the Tang is what we would say a middling one, few hundred years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, it's been called the Golden Age, and we think there's good reason for that. It's not simply because of the ceramics. We have to be honest. It's not just the pots.
Well, now, do we?
Yeah. Well, we don't have to.
We don't have to. This is a podcast about ceramics, Paul.
Absolutely, yeah. We think it's the ceramics. But in actual fact, there's an extraordinary renaissance going on. It's in that period of time that, in inverted commas, porcelain is invented.
Yes.
But it's also across the arts of painting, mural decoration, architecture. And the Chinese lay claim to have effectively invented printing and the book. And it's the golden age, no doubt.
That's right. So we're going to get into today the story of the Tang Dynasty and their incredible funerary figurines. Of course, you mentioned this is the era when porcelain really is invented, if you will, in China, and we start to see porcelain coming through in a really powerful way, and we'll continue to come back to that. But these Tang Dynasty figures, for me, they're some of my favorite things in all of clay, having a lot to do with the glazing and the surface and the bright colors, but also sort of the softness of the forms. So I thought we could sort of position ourselves and take ourselves back a little bit here. We can maybe imagine ourselves standing in the heart of Chang'an, the Tang capital, which is the contemporary city of Xi'an today. So we're talking about central eastern China. And at this point, it's a massive metropolis.
Yeah.
It's about 2 million people, Paul.
Quite absolutely staggering. And I couldn't believe the numbers, and so I went back checking because, we tend to exaggerate. But we're talking about a city which would be a huge city today.
And central government, imperial palaces, the streets are packed with people and energy. And I would imagine you could hear multiple different languages being spoken, merchants sort of kicking up dust as they move through the streets, arriving from the Silk Road, smell of exotic spices. In the city, all of this sort of bustling activity is happening, but we're going to be descending into the dark, cool tombs below, right? Because that's where we're going to find these incredible objects, spirit objects, or Mingqi.
I think they're some of the greatest things that were ever made.
They are.
They're truly wonderful.
I mean, I would like to say, I feel like we often say that. We're sort of this is
Every
an
episode,
exceptional thing. This is like the most amazing thing ever made, and I think that's just a testament to these incredible craftsmen that have come before us and these cultures that have developed these really unique, vibrant traditions that we get so excited about talking about.
And there's a weird shock value, isn't there, with these things? There are magnificent things, but you anticipate them. I would say the golden age of porcelain, which is not actually Tang, it's later. It's a slow creep into magnificence. Now, whilst it's a couple of hundred years, it's almost like there's a sudden appearance of this representational, extraordinary way of depicting things on a big scale. Is shockingly wonderful.
Well, and I think what's interesting, and I love your perspective on this too, is that the Tang figures, it seemed to be sort of an industry of making these for tombs, these funerary wares, and they were not just for the imperial class. Is that correct? Are they going into sort of the upper class merchant? It seems that there's sort of a factory industry here of making these objects, and there's with any ceramics, there's some that are exceptionally fine, and others that are maybe more streamlined or stylized, simplified.
Yeah, it's a hugely interesting question. And before I get myself in deep trouble with all the great Chinese scholars out there, my perception, and I think it's largely justified looking at it, when you get a city of 2 million people, you're not dealing with a tiny ruling elite anymore. You're dealing with a mercantile class.
Who can afford and purchase these items.
A quasi-middle class. Yeah. In other words, the wealth is spreading and is getting less high and less religious and more secular and more to do with really the celebration of life of a wider group of people. I think it's pretty fair to say that.
Paul, can you sort of situate for us, how big is the Tang Dynasty?
Well, it's the simple word is staggering, Stephanie, I would say, in terms of its scale. And looking at the rest of the world, at this point in time, London was about 40,000 people. Chang'an, 2 million, so a couple of dozen Londons. Is quite extraordinary when you think about it. So we're dealing with an enormous scale. We think around 26 cities with 500,000 to 1 million inhabited in those. So we're dealing with very large-scale population and everything that implies, feeding them, housing them, and so forth. And then just looking to the rest of China, it's often been pointed out that and we did, the Qing dynasty establishes China and China remains the enormous landmass. But we shouldn't think it was stable and happy through that very long period of time. It was forever collapsing into internal war. So we could easily argue that it was there and then not there and then there again. So we would largely credit the Tang Dynasty with finally reunifying a bickering China with internal civil wars, and they managed to more or less stabilize it for the first couple of 100 years of their control and reign.
So can we talk a little bit about who is in charge of this entirely massive society and how is it structured?
We tend to credit one magnificent emperor who re-established order and control in China. He led the Tang and then his sons after him. And this was Li Huang, who was succeeded by his sons. Now, in some ways, he reflects the first emperor back in the Qin period in that he spent a lot of time standardizing and controlling not just the Tang region, but the whole of China itself. He established a new code of law. He employed an enormous civil service. Needless to say, he reformed and built and strengthened the military, very much so. And he organized government. He was famous for not simply appointing the sons and daughters of the aristocracy. It was very meritocratic and re-established examinations to enter into the civil service, and then beyond that,
he's encouraging education, but it's still sort of still a caste system, isn't it? Though,
hugely so.
Yeah. So I don't want to paint too rosy a picture here.
Yes,
but it's not as maybe clear as imperial ruling family and everyone else. There is sort of a hierarchy and a structure, but he is trying to encourage education, which is perhaps where the flourishing comes from, right? When you're sharing that kind of knowledge.
Yeah. I suppose the key word probably is merit. There was a system whereby being talented, if you were lucky enough to get into education and therefore you could advance
Right.
and you could grow.
So this is someone who is perhaps more tolerant of foreign ideas than other rulers of China.
Yep.
That I think an interesting note is that the royal Leaf family was non-Han Chinese origin, maybe from a Turkish-speaking Central Asia.
Yep.
Someone here who is clearly looking out in this moment and
very much so,
influenced
yeah.
but by other ideas, welcoming education. And the funerary figurines that we're going to be talking about are these. Do you think that it's the Li family that's saying, right, we want these, what are we thinking about for our afterlife and our tomb or legacy, right?
Yep.
Because we have this starting certainly, as you mentioned, with the first emperor and the Terracotta warriors, right? That sets up this incredible legacy of making brilliant ceramic objects to be buried with, to sort of carry on in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And we think that this is similar.
I think yes to everything, but I think
yes and maybe.
It's educated speculation, isn't it? How it comes about. First of all, we should remind ourselves, 800 years on from the Terracotta warriors, and they're long gone.
Yeah.
So, and they're underground.
And we don't know about them at this point.
And these people did not know about them. Now, did the residual skills of those thousands of craftsmen, that could have been father to son, mother to daughter, that could have been a continuum in skill.
Well, but clearly, I think we can look at the history of Chinese ceramics and understand that those skills weren't lost because even though we've lost at this point in time, they're lost to memory, right? We have an incredible Chinese ceramic tradition, right? That's come out of that, which I can only really imagine is from that kind of transcendent sharing of knowledge and passing of knowledge.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, as you know, it's something I'm deeply interested in, is the history of skill. Because as an almost abstract phenomenon, it persists and is handed on and very hard to grasp, but nevertheless is evident that quite often when you get culture growing to the highest level in a great city, like Chang'an, or like late 19th century Paris, or like many other cities, 20th century New York, it's to do with accumulation of skills over a long period of time. And a cosmopolitan center that pulls that skill in.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's happening here, because skill being pulled in from across China, and as you rightly point out, Chinese culture generally has recognized the existence of other empires.
Right.
Now, with the golden age of the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great is again, and his conquering right across up to the borders of India and China. So we're dealing with, and that's again a long time before, but we're dealing with sophisticated other empires which border onto.
Right.
And we must remind ourselves, early 7th century, so overlapping with this dynasty, with Tang, the birth of Islam and the rise of the Arabs.
Well, and I want to just jump in and before we get lost to history and this really massive history lesson,
absolutely.
let's maybe refocus ourselves on the ceramics for a minute, because we're going to be talking about some of the work that was actually found in the mausoleum for the Li family.
Yeah.
And, unlike many other ceramic traditions, the Tang ceramics, they strongly favor representation. And so we're going to be focusing on these tomb figurines that were intended to accompany the deceased to the afterlife, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about these tombs specifically. Is religion playing a role? Who gets to be buried in them? Are they underground in a pit? Are they raised in a pyramid? What's the sort of situation here?
These are royal graves. Now, the first emperor of China, as we know, to a level of insanity of building a tomb site that's the same size as Manhattan.
Yeah.
We're dealing here with royal graves of a similar kind, probably with one eye, again, with protecting the tomb so that it isn't pillaged or attacked. And this would be an ongoing, they were acutely aware and within living memory, wars, invasions, and the need to protect one's culture is there. So the interesting aspect, as you raise, is this move to very powerful figurative elements, which seems to come out of, quite hard to see where it comes from, but develops quite rapidly. Now, had they picked up some things, it's highly cosmopolitan, this culture. So no doubt they were seeing things from all over the place that were coming in. So let's speculate that they embraced the idea of representation. We know they had it in their painting and mural work, so the ceramic develops alongside that, and illustrative volumes and book and printmaking as well. So they develop a mode of representation.
And I would say that, clearly the objects that have been found represent the court, they represent the lifestyle, they represent sort of living people and ideas. And so the Li family built their own mausoleum, which has, I think the number is, it was built in 684, and it holds the remains of the various members of the Li imperial family of the Tang Dynasty. And it's located in Shanxi province, which is about 85 kilometers northwest of Xi'an. So, and you can go there today. You can see these sort of magnificent tomb structures that come up out of the ground. But the thing for me, and I think we talked about this a bit with the Terracotta warriors too, is that these don't seem to be identical objects, right? There's an amazing amount of expressive gesture and not just in the faces, but kind of in the posture of the figures. They all seem to be unique and individual within a genre of a female court figure, of camels, of horses, right? But they're all, no two of these are alike.
So we should ponder on this, and you can help us understand how they could have made them.
Yeah.
As you know, as I endlessly tell you, I was in this extraordinary exhibition in Australia of Tang Dynasty. So the horses come in all sizes, up to life size.
Yeah.
So crudely, even though we think they didn't know them, on the scale of the Terracotta warriors, we're dealing with that epic increased size and scale.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that there's there's some fascinating technological aspects to this work. The variety in size. Maybe one would assume that the larger objects are meant for higher classes within the royal family. Smaller ones, these are me making assumptions here. I'm not a scholar, but they would have to have been specialized workshops, right? Artisans sort of turning out these figures to meet this massive demand for these spirit objects. I also think it's interesting that they're called spirit objects, that they're actually meant to sort of hold within the spirit of the person or the object to carry those forward. They're certainly not made on the potter's wheel. They're hand built, probably using molds, coiling technique for basic shapes, and then which that's going to allow for repetitive serial production. But press molding. So again, sort of probably making a positive, taking a cast off of that in ceramics or carving that shape out and then pressing wet clay in to peel out. They could have been using wood to carve these. They could have been using other ceramics.
Right. Okay.
But then these individual pieces are refined by hand, which allows them to carry with them this remarkable sense of individuality. And I really think that's part of the same kind of legacy as the Terracotta warriors. Even though there's not a direct contiguous line or link, these are similar methods that skill has been passed down through the ages. Yeah.
Traditions of artisanship.
Yeah, exactly. And these, not all of them, but many of, I think, the fabulous ones have glaze on them.
Now, glaze.
Glaze, a thin layer of glass melted on the surface of ceramic. And in this case, the primary material that was being used on these is lead. So lead melts at a very low temperature. It makes a very clear, shiny, transparent glaze or glass. And they figured out how to use different oxides and colorants found in the earth: cobalt, manganese, copper, iron. And they're using these colorants to color the glass. And they create this incredible kind of patchwork of glazes. I think it reminds me of sort of stained glass in a way.
Right.
There's little, you have to see these, but they're sort of little drops of glaze of different color in a pattern would have been applied, and then those objects would have been fired vertically standing up. And so where the little drops of glaze overlap, they create this running. So you have this thing that starts out as an organized pattern, but by the time it's done glaze or firing, it's all sort of pooled and pulled down the side of the object, because lead glazes are very fluid or they've got a very high melting kind of characteristics. And so we have these vivid colors.
Do you think they used that deliberately once they realized what was likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of early sort of glazed pieces come to us from sort of ash of the wood firing in the kiln, building up on the surface and getting hot enough to melt.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, they figured out that this material, that lead, melts at a much lower temperature. These are sort of earthenware. These are low fire pieces. They're not high fire vitreous porcelains.
Yeah.
They're sort of a tan earthenware color clay with these vibrant colors.
I was going to ask about that. So the kiln technology is can be quite basic at this stage.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would call it basic. I would just call it being fired to a lower temperature. Yeah.
Because we know that porcelain was around. So
Porcelain.
So we know they knew how to get up there.
Exactly. But these objects are not being made in Jingdezhen, which is the porcelain capital of China, where those beautiful porcelains are still made today. These objects are being made with a different clay, a different clay body, different recipes. But you have these like incredible realistic figures, courtiers, musicians, animals, all sort of dripping in glaze. And the type of glaze is referred to as Sancai, or 3-color. Right. So there's often 3 colors, maybe amber, green, and brown, or sometimes there's purple. They were using manganese, blues, greens, and each of these drops just overlapping it's really incredibly beautiful to look at. Some of my favorite pieces, I know we rely on the collection of the Met really heavily as we're passing images back and forth, and there's an incredible Ewer piece there with a really bulbous bottom, skinny neck, really big handle, and it's colored in this typical traditional sort of amber, yellow, green, and white Sancai glaze combination, and everything's just sort of dripping and pooling and pulling down. There's an incredible sense of volume to these pots. One of my all-time favorite pots is this jar that's in the Met's collection. It's a covered jar. It has an incredible swell and sense of breath. It's almost as if the maker blew air into it at the end. I talk with my students about postures of pottery in a vessel, and I think a great vessel looks like it just took a big breath of air. It's the difference between looking at a ballerina flat-footed or on point, right? It's that breath, that kind of attitude, and all of these works, the figurines and these vessels have that, right? So on this covered jar, there is kind of, a unique piece because it starts to have a pattern within these droplets of glaze.
Yeah, it's a magnificent creature, and I couldn't agree more. It's pushed out to its optimum.
Yeah,
and I like the idea that it's just breathed in.
It's just breathed in, and that's the thing that my teacher, Linda Sikora, would always talk to us about when we were learning how to make. She would say that the most important and the last place you should touch a pot was on its inside, so that it had that sense. And these Tang artists knew that. They knew that with the sculptures. They knew that with the pots. And so we've talked about a couple of pots, but I think another really wonderful piece to look at is the set of 10 entertainers and 2 dancers. There's 10 musicians, female musicians, sort of seated on their knees. And then there's 2 dancers, dancing in their beautiful dress, and their arms are sort of swooping up over their heads. There's an incredible sense of movement, almost as if this scene has been captured by a photograph, but it's being captured in clay.
It's magnificent. And I was lucky enough in one of my roles at the Sainsbury's Centre. They had a set of 4 of these figures.
Lucky you.
And they swirl around in a circle. And I couldn't agree more. It's to do with the heads are all slightly, and the arm movement, so that it's like somebody's taken a snapshot
of this scene actively happening. And these figures don't have that typical Sancai glaze on them. They do seem to have the remnants of colored pigments of either paint or slip, giving us other sort of realistic elements of their dress.
I mean, you could correct me, but and I'm sure you will.
Many times over the years.
The color range is superb and particular because of the chemistry. One thinks of the magnificent greens and the mustardy coloured yellows and so forth, and then the pinky reds that you get, subdued reds. But they accept the range of their palette.
I think so,
and they understand that the poetry has got to come out of that.
And they clearly have a sense of what we now today call color theory, right? Greens paired with sort of reddish ambers. These are complementary colors.
They know how things push and pull.
Exactly. And so those 2 colors paired next to each other are going to make each other feel brighter. But what I love about this series of work, or these courtly figures, is one, it really demonstrates a cultural openness that the court of the Tang Dynasty was interested in and promoted music, dance, fashion.
Absolutely.
Right. These are all really amazing things, but they also often depict foreigners. So where did this cultural openness come from, do we think?
There are 2 points there which we can embrace. And whilst we accept how magnificently important ceramic is, of course, what the dancers show us is, 1, performance and music. So musical instruments being pulled in, especially from, it's often referred to as Turkish, but essentially, going west, and the lands which we broadly acknowledge drifting over as far as Turkey, and all kinds of things coming in. We're in a period where the Silk Road is established, of trade routes going backwards and forwards over enormous different distances. So textile, printmaking, painting, mural decoration, all of the visual arts,
and they're also
dance and music,
and they're also expanding through sea trade at this point too.
Well, they were the great shipbuilders, so we tend not to think immediately of the Chinese as in terms of ships. We think of the Vikings and other cultures, but actually at this point in time, and for hundreds of years going forward, they were the great shipbuilders, and they were everywhere. So we have that sense of this expanding Chinese culture, which is feeding these cities.
And feeding the representation of the ceramics, right? And so, there's a really wonderful Camel from the Chicago Art Institute collection, which has an incredible Tang Dynasty collection of works, and it's Camel and its rider, and it's a non-Chinese person, right? So we can sort of see that there's this cosmopolitan kind of aspect.
That's exactly the word. Let's talk about these creatures for a little while, because you're absolutely right that they all have a sense of individuality, that an individual is...
And that they're telling a story.
Yeah. And there's a narrative there, and we can pick up that. These are things which are about things. But you can always tell a Tang Dynasty piece. Always. From a million miles away, you can see. So we think of, say, a good quality horse or camel. they're incredibly proud.
So
I mean, these the camels are, look at me and look at.
They have that same posture that pot has. But
Yeah.
I want to just for our listeners, you and I have been looking at this stuff for a long time, and perhaps folks out there have as well. But you just said you can look at a Tang Dynasty piece and just know it's Tang Dynasty. How? Like, is there a way that you could you describe to me what are the characteristics that you look at and go, yeah, Tang?
Very difficult. I was going to ask you that question so that you could answer it. So often in life, and actually it goes over a wide range of things, like so many of human beings, so many of our facial features are the same through millions of us. And yet none of us have trouble recognizing immediately someone we know. In other words, it's the slightly different configuration is one element. But I would say for me in Tang, there's always a pose. If you look at the camel, they've always got their head, but they're always so proud. Look at me, I'm great. The horses have a certain kind of poise and pride in themselves, which is, I don't want to caricature it, but it is almost like that.
Well, but I would say, I think it comes back to this conversation around individuality, because these were based on actual camels, on actual breeds of horses, right? So it's the Bactrian camel they were sort of essential for crossing the deserts of northern Tibet. So we have this camel, and on the back of the camel sits a saddle covered in sort of a bright draped fabric, and on top of that is an entire band of 5 male musicians in this one piece that's really like crazy incredible. It's like 8th century, and it was buried in the western suburbs of Chang'an. And this piece is in the National Museum of China in Beijing. But we have, this like fabric drape, these 5 musicians on the back of the camel. You're right. The camel's neck and head is sort of like thrown back, sort of looking upwards in a way. And they all have these individual positions and poses. And so for me, like, this feels like this was an actual band of people traveling across the makers of these, I would imagine, who did a lot of drawing of sketches of people and places and specific animals.
I was going to raise that with you. It seems to me, if we think of the dancing figures and their poses, we look at the horses and camels, surely we're into an age of life drawing, of studying from nature directly. By the way, that's one hell of a big camel to have 5 people on its back.
Right.
So let's assume that's imagination a little bit.
But it's also actuality, because we can look at the type of hats. They're wearing these sort of pointed felt caps, which indicate that they are Sogdian of an origin, which is an ancient Iranian civilization. So there's actual specificity within the clothes, within the hats, within the sort of the patterning, and I think if we're really thinking about that question of how do you know it's a Tang Dynasty piece, it has to do, for me, one, the glaze. The glazing is so iconic that you can see that glaze and go, Tang.
The color.
But not all of them are glazed. So it really has to do with individuality, and it has to do with that posture. Yeah. That poise, that reaching upward.
On the horses, and I think the camels too, the nostrils are often wide open. It's almost...
it's like they're breathing, or they've been running or racing or transporting, and they're sort of flared in a way.
Yeah, distinct pose.
Yeah.
Always.
And so these Tang Dynasty emperors were obsessed with horses, right? So it's not just camels coming across the desert, but horses were really the prized animal in the Tang Dynasty. But there's a very specific story that has to do with the breed of these horses. They had sort of very thin skin and lighter colored hair. Okay. And so when they're racing across, their nostrils are flaring, their veins are are pumping blood throughout their body, and that you could, the veins would sort of raise to the edge of the horse's skin. They were referred to as heavenly horses. Those are the sort of the most prized horses, and they were white. They were known for their speed, their endurance, and I think that the horses that we see in the Tang Dynasty figurines, these being key, these are those horses.
Yeah.
These are the, there's an intense pride, and really, I think, honoring these animals through that. And so there's this myth that they would sweat blood.
That's extraordinary. And what, just to remind ourselves, the horse-driven warfare, incredibly important. And what develops in previous centuries via various cultures, not least the Mongols, but others as well, of superbly trained horsemen who can shoot arrows from horseback, charioteers, and so forth. So the horse, again, goes way beyond the idea of having fun riding a horse or racing a horse.
Right.
They aid the military expansion and military. So we might well think of the horse in that way, as going from the super-duper lovely sports car or Rolls-Royce through to tanks and jeeps, if you get the analogy, in warfare. And clearly the Tang exploited that. One thing I also found interesting is the extent to which warfare through the ancient period and going forward frequently has an agreed pattern. This is how we go to war, and this is how we fight, and we stop at certain times of the year, and we and the Tang, along others, made warfare far more pragmatic. It was about winning. And they reduced the ritual, but as with their arts, they pulled in the military ideas from all over their empire.
And they represented those in these Tang figurines. So we have, there's wonderful sculptures of horses with a rider on it, right? And it looks, what I love about these horses is it's almost as if the platform that the animal is built on, it's on a little slab of clay, and then all 4 feet are attached to the floor. It's almost like they've made that slightly narrower so that the horse or the camel feels bigger, or almost like it's going to spring off this little platform. So we have this beautiful horse with a rider on it, again from the Metz collection. The rider's got a red hat on him, and he's wearing a kind of a green tunic of sorts, and again that this horse feels like it's just about to spring forward. The rider has his hand sort of in a salute, and he's confident. He's the horse is confident, and I think they're both representing this central role that perhaps the cavalry played in the Tang expansion of their dynasty.
And also represents their industrial might. They're breeding these creatures. They protect society, their transportation, and their pleasure.
Right. Well, and it brings us to the idea of leisure. Right. And perhaps the inner courts of the Tang Dynasty, the Tang palaces, where we see, we have some really beautiful, we talked about the musicians earlier, but there are sort of all of these really lovely, sweet young people. And there's a young girl seated holding maybe a mirror or a brush. And they're these sort of sweet little, again, feel like snapshots in some ways. But I do want to talk about 2 pieces that show kind of a fascinating shift for women in the court during the Tang Dynasty. And one is, there's some earlier kind of aristocratic statues that show women very, very sort of rigid and Confucian sort of etiquette. They have their hands concealed modestly. They have sort of voluminous flowing fan sleeves. But over time, we see a change in those figures, which would seem to indicate kind of a growing sense of independence. The figures start to have a more sort of delicate body sways or tilts, and we can look back to the seated musicians and dancers that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. But there's this beautiful 8th century seated court lady from the Met that I think brings to us this moment of leisure, of life. She's sort of a plumper young woman. She's sitting relaxed. She has a playful lapdog at her feet. She's sitting on an hourglass-shaped rattan stool that's originally thought to be from South Asia. And so the bright colors on these pieces showcase this new idea about beauty emerging in the 8th century. Full-figured women, elaborate hairstyles kind of piled on top of their head, really high. This beauty is based on a highly influential, beloved concubine of the emperor. So we see these new beauty standards. I think that's really interesting. But we also see women engaging in sport and the outdoor life of the emperor. And I think this is we were talking about how horses were originally bred for the elite military classes, but we start to see them entering into sort of equestrian sports, right? So women playing playing polo, right? So there's an couple of incredible pieces from the Musée Guimet that show these really striking. The horses are no longer sort of attached to those four little kind of square or rectangle at the base.
No, they're galloping.
They're galloping, they're moving, they're turning. There's this incredible polo player. She's swinging, and it's a woman, and she's swinging her arm down to hit the polo ball. And polo was a widely valued entertainment, but also it was a training. It was a training for warfare. And we see indication that women played sport, and it was more than kind of a much more socially inclusive period, as demonstrated. Granted, we're not seeing a ton of these figures, but I think that this is really, for me, it's really exciting to see these very specific examples of not just a bunch of women, but women engaging in leisure, in pleasure, representing changing elements of society, and engaging in a sport that was seen to be a warfare training ground for men.
I couldn't agree more. It seems to me that we reach a point, probably by the 8th century, where the depictions seem to me to hint at equality in a more developed way. So we've got a highly sophisticated society. We've got money around. We've got, it's anachronistic to say middle class wealth, but effectively there's wealth
Cosmopolitan.
spreading. There's wealth spreading. And what does that lead to? Well, it usually leads to things like sport, theatre, dancing, and we have all of that. And all the way through that, we have depictions of women. And the interesting thing about them is that they look like women.
They do.
They look like real women. The sitting figure, the court lady, she looks knowable in a straightforward sense of being depicted how women are.
Right.
And that would hint at a sense of, a growing sense of life in which equality is a component.
I think so. And, we are so lucky that we have this incredible wide range of these Tang funerary figurines that allow us to take a look into their world and have this conversation today. So thanks. I think that's a great place to close. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you, Paul.
And it's always exciting to find out how these things were done.
So that's it from us this week. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed listening to this discussion today, please follow The History of Ceramics wherever you get your podcasts and go ahead and leave us a comment. Or you can go to henny.com/The History of Ceramics.